G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Lamentations. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're into the Book of Lamentations, and this is the very first session. So we'll see how we go. Enjoy. Okay, so introduction, Book of Lamentations. It's the second book that Jeremiah wrote. It's only 5 chapters. Jeremiah was 52 chapters long, but this is only 5. The section of the title of the book is divided into 5 sections. Now, we see the little chart there. It has Hebrew, Greek, English, the way the rabbis speak about it, and Latin. Okay, Hebrew title is Akah, which means or how or alas. It's based upon the first word of this book. It's spelled E-I-C-H-A on your screen there. And according to the rabbis, only 3 prophets ever used this word. First of all, Moses used it in Deuteronomy 1, verse 12. He uses it to describe the happiness of Israel. Wow, the happiness of Israel. Second, Isaiah uses it in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21, Isaiah 1:21, and he uses it in Israel's infidelity. And then third, Jeremiah uses it here in Lamentations 1:1, 2:1, 4:1, 2. He also uses it in Israel's discipline. So this word or how or alas could have both good or bad connotations. Now, there's, as I said, 3 prophets that actually use this word in the Hebrew text. The second title is the Greek name for this book is Threnos. The Greek word means dirges, D-I-R-G-E-S. While the Hebrew title is based upon the first word, the Greek title is based upon the content of the book. Why? Because it contains 5 dirges that Jeremiah wrote. And we have the English word, it's the easiest one, Lamentations of Jeremiah. It just follows the Greek title of the Septuagint. It's also based upon the content of the book. And the rabbis had another name for this book. Rabbinical name was Kinot. It means Lamentations. The rabbinical name, like the English and Greek name, is based upon the content of the book, because the book contains Lamentations. And we have the Latin name was Threni, very similar to the Greek name. It also means Lamentations. And this name came from the Septuagint, and it is also based upon the content of the book. Septuagint, remember, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures done around about 250 BC. That's the Septuagint. Now, the author has always been reckoned to be Jeremiah the prophet. English title reads as the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Now, the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text, does not actually use Jeremiah's name. In the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation, which I said made in 250 BC, Jeremiah's name is in the title. Also, Josephus, who was a 1st century historian, he also assigns Lamentations to the writing of Jeremiah. The Jewish Talmud also assigns this book to Jeremiah in a tractate called Baba Bathra 15a. So these are pretty ancient witnesses to the author of this book. So the Septuagint, 250 BC, down to Josephus, to the Talmud, all witness that Jeremiah was the author. So Jeremiah is indeed the author of this book. Another way of showing that Jeremiah had to be the author is to show that Lamentations is very similar to the book of Jeremiah. And there are a great number of similarities here between these 2 books. First of all, both books mention that Israel is forsaken by her lovers. In Jeremiah, we see it in chapter 30, verse 14, Lamentations, chapter 1, verse 2. Second, both of them mention that Jeremiah's eyes are full of water. Jeremiah 9, verse 1 and 18. Also in Lamentations, we'll find it in chapter 1, verse 16 and chapter 2, verse 11. So there are 2 similarities so far. And then we have the third one is the expression terror on every side. Remember, we found it right back in Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 25. And we also find it here in Lamentations chapter 2, verse 22. So these are the terms that Jeremiah uses in his book, and lo and behold, They're in the book of Lamentations as well. And we have fourth, which is the cup of wrath for Edom. Jeremiah 49:12 mentions this, but also Lamentations 4, verse 21. So what we see here, there are four very basic common expressions between Jeremiah and Lamentations. So these strong similarities also point out the fact that Jeremiah was indeed the author of this book. Okay, so some more comparisons between the three books, Jeremiah, 2 Kings, Lamentations. And if we look at these three books, it's apparent that Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations. Now, first of all, we see the siege of Jerusalem. We see that in 2 Kings, in 2 Kings 25, verses 1 to 2. In Jeremiah chapter 39, 1 to 2. It's all on the screen there. And Jeremiah 52, 45. Lamentations chapter 2, verse 22, and chapter 3, verses 5 and 7. Issue of the famine, 2 Kings 25, 3, Jeremiah 37, 21, and 38, 9, and 52, 6. Lamentations 1, verse 1, verse 19, chapter 2, verse 11 to 12, and 19 to 21, and chapter 4, verse 4 to 5, and 9 to 10. And also, there's the expectation of help and the collapse of that expectation, which they expected. Israel expected help, but it didn't come. It's found in 2 Kings 25, verses 1 to 11, and also in Jeremiah 37, verses 6 to 11. Lamentations, we see it in Lamentations 1, verse 7, 4, verse 17, and 5, verse 6. Then there's the flight of the king, escape of the king, Zedekiah. 2 Kings is found in 25, 4 to 7. Jeremiah 39, verse 4 to 7. Jeremiah 52, verse 7 to 11. And Lamentations chapter 4, verses 19 to 20. Demolition of the walls of Jerusalem, 2 Kings 25, 10, Jeremiah 39, 8, and 52, 14. Lamentations chapter 2, verses 8 to 9. Then there's the looting or the sacking of the temple. See this in Kings 25, 13 to 17, 2 Kings. Jeremiah 52, 17 to 23. Lamentations 1, verse 10, and chapter 2, verses 6 to 7. Then there's the burning of the temple and other buildings of Jerusalem. 2 Kings 25, 8 to 9. It's all in 2 Kings, except for the last one. And in Jeremiah 37, verse 8, 39, verse 8, and 52, verse 13. Lamentations, we find in chapter 4, verse 11. Then we have Judah's fickle political alliances. 2 Kings 24, 2, Jeremiah 30, verse 14. Lamentations in chapter 1, verse 2, and verse 8, verse 17, and verse 19. Okay. We see the ninth is the slaughter of the leadership. 2 Kings 25, 18 to 21, Jeremiah 39, 6, 52, 10, 24 to 27, Lamentations 2, verse 2, verse 20, and chapter 4, verse 16. And then we have the exile. All three deal with it again. 2 Kings 25, 11 to 12. 2 Kings 25 is a common chapter. Jeremiah 39, 9 to 10, and then 52, 15 to 16. Lamentations 1, verse 1, 4, verse, and 4 to 5. Also verse 18. Then we have chapter 2, verse 9, verse 14, chapter 4, verse 22, and chapter 5, verse 2. And then the last one, the provincial status of Judah, 2 Kings 25, 22, 24 to 25. And then we have in Jeremiah, it's found in 39, verse 11 to chapter 40, verse 16, Lamentations chapter 1, verse 1. So these are all some comparisons which demonstrate that Jeremiah was the author of Lamentations. All right. Now, the date, when was it written? We've got several clues to this. It's obviously after the fall of Jerusalem. That's what the Lamentations is about. It mentions the siege. It mentions the famine. It mentions disease, the final destruction, which occurred on July 19th, 586 BC. Second, it occurred after the burning of the temple on August the 14th, 586 BC. Third thing we see is that the writing of the book, it occurred before Jeremiah's forced march into Egypt after Gedaliah's assassination. And the fourth thing we see here regarding the date, it occurred sometime before the death of Gedaliah in October 586 BC. So our best conclusion, when it was written, it's sometime between August the 15th, 586 BC, and the month of October 586 BC. That's 586 years before Christ. I mean, that to get these dates, wow. Where does it fit into the canon of Scripture? Well, in the Masoretic text, Lamentations is located in the third section of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is known as the writings. It's the Ketuvim. It's not in the law, it's not in the prophets, but it's in the writings. Others, such as the Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, and some English translations, place it right after the book of Jeremiah. Why? Because it's more of a logical order this way. The Masoretic or the Hebrew text places it in accordance with the section of what is called the 5 megalots. Yeah, the place in the canon in the Masoretic or Hebrew text, it is the third of the 5 megalots. Now, 5 megalots are the 5 small scrolls, right? Now, each scroll is used for a special occasion. So there are 5 of these small scrolls, these megalot, which were used during the Jewish calendar. And I'm going to show you where they are used now. First of all, the first of the 5 is the Song of Solomon, little short book, which is read during Passover. The second is the book of Ruth, and that is read during Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. And third is the book of Lamentations, which is where we are. It's read during the Jewish observant of Tisha B'Av. It's mentioned in Zechariah 7, 3-5, Zechariah 3-5, which means the 9th of Av, that's Tisha B'Av, 9th of Av. It's the name of the Jewish month on the 9th of the month of Av. This is when Jerusalem was destroyed. The fourth of the 5 megalots is Ecclesiastes. It's read during Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And then the fifth of these 5 megalots is the book of Esther, which is read during the Feast of Purim. Okay, and now just for your info, if you might know, the Masoretic text is the basis for most Protestant translations of the Old Testament, such as the King James Version, the ESV, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, New International Version. These are the Masoretic text is the basis for those translation. You know, the Masoretic text, this is the Hebrew text, differs from previous forms of the Hebrew Bible because previously the consonants were written down in the scrolls, while the ancient tradition of those consonants should be read out loud was preserved orally. How you would read them out, it was preserved orally. The Hebrew doesn't have vowels, all right? Just consonants. You got to work out which vowel goes where. Okay, that's a little bit of stuff for you. All right. Theology of Lamentations. What is its theology? What's it about? It shows us 3 things. 3 things. First, it shows a believer's response in national crisis. Now, the book of Job shows a believer's response in times of personal crisis. The book of Job is a great example of a believer's response to any personal crisis. Lamentations is a great picture of a believer's response in times of national crisis. So that's the first thing. Second thing, it shows is the results of disobedience are taught in Lamentations. Disobedience will bring on the judgment of God. That's what Lamentations teaches us. Also, the third thing is this book teaches the vindication of divine righteousness and covenant relationship. Remember, Israel is a covenant nation, and it's because of Israel's covenantal relationship with God that this judgment came upon Judah. So the third point of theology is the vindication of divine righteousness because of this covenantal relationship between God and Israel. Remember, to whom much is given, much is required. So the greater light one has will bring greater judgment. So I think one of the New Testament writers says, don't be a teacher, because you've got to be careful being a teacher. The greater light you have, the greater judgment comes on you. Okay. Now, how does it contribute to the canon, the whole scripture? It makes two contributions, two specific areas of systematic theology. First of all, hamartiology. What's that mean? That's about the doctrine of sin. And Israelology, the doctrine of Israel. So Lamentations regarding hamartiology, the doctrine of sin, is going to address the worst sin in scripture, which is idolatry. The judgment that fell upon Judah and is described in Lamentations was the result of King Manasseh's sins. Now, this king not only sinned personally, but what he did was he led his people in forsaking their God and worshiping idols. Such was the extent of their sin that the nation actually reached the point of no return. Judgment could not be alleviated. Physical judgment had to come, and God declared he was going to wipe out Jerusalem as he had the northern kingdom of Israel. And you can check that out in 2 Kings 21, 13 to 15 and Jeremiah 15, verse 4. So Lamentations describes the consequences of the judgment, and it vindicates God's righteousness in the context of this covenant relationship between Israel and God. Now, the second thing it contributes to is Israelology. Lamentations shows us the outworking of the Mosaic covenant. Remember, God made this Mosaic covenant with Israel right back in Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 to 8, Exodus 19, 3 to 8, and the scriptural account of it extends from Exodus 20, verse 1, Exodus 20, verse 1 to Deuteronomy 28, verse 68, Deuteronomy 28, 68. Yeah, Mosaic covenant, the key provision of the Mosaic covenant was the law of Moses. Remember, law of Moses contained 613 commandments. Now, included in these laws, there were blessings for obedience. If you obeyed these particular laws, you were blessed. If you disobeyed, you'd be cursed. Now, this was signed and sealed. This law that God gave to Moses was signed and sealed by the Shekinah glory, the manifest presence of God, in such a way that rendered the covenant conditional, right? Conditional means if you do this, I'll bless you. If you don't do this, I'll curse you. That's conditional. Again, Exodus 24, 1 to 11. Exodus 24, 1 to 11. Okay, so the book of Lamentations contributes to the canon of scripture by relating the historical event of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple to a person's experiences. It describes how this destruction affected Jeremiah on a personal level. Remember, Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. It also with this, Lamentations also reveals the righteousness and the truth of God. It vindicates his righteousness. And lastly, Lamentations contains the hope of future restoration, and it promises that Jehovah will one day restore his people. So that's thus far. What's its theme? What's the theme of the book? What's the theme? Well, the theme of Lamentations is the lament over the destruction and desolation of Jerusalem and the temple. We're going to find in Lamentations, we have 5 chapters. We're going to have 5 funeral dirges or laments where Jeremiah grieves over the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. What's the style? Well, what is the style of it? Well, the style is very important. Now, some of these points don't come out in English. because the Bible, Masoretic text was written in Hebrew. Initially, it was written in Hebrew. So some of these points only come out in the Hebrew. Couple of things, well, several things. First of all, chapters 1 to 4 are written in the acrostic form. Okay, what does that mean? By acrostic form, we mean that each verse begins with the subsequent Hebrew letter. Okay, let me try and explain this. So, chapter 1, verse 1, if it was written in English, chapter 1, verse 1, the first letter of the alphabet is A. So it would begin, the first verse would begin with the letter A, which would have a word which means something. In the Hebrew, the first letter is the letter Aleph. Aleph, A-L-E-P-H. The second verse, so the first verse of the first chapter would begin with the letter Aleph. Right? The second verse begins with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Bet, and it would keep going on and on and on. So chapter 4 are written in this acrostic form. Chapter 1 uses the normal alphabet, 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 1 uses the normal order of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So from chapter 1, verse 1 down to chapter 1, verse 22, we're going to see the verse of the first letter of each verse will start with that particular letter of the alphabet. We'll show you as you go through. Okay. Now, just to throw a little bit in here, in chapters 2, 3, and 4, 2 of the letters are reversed, all right? Ayin, A-Y-I-N, Ayin, which is letter number 16 of the 22 of the Hebrew alphabet, and Pei, P-E-Y, which is letter 17 of 22. And we're going to see in the Pei precedes the Ayin rather than the normal way in which the Ayin precedes the Pei. Okay. I know you're wondering, why do we need to know this? Well, we're going to find out. So chapters 1 to 4, written in the acrostic form, chapter 1 uses 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet in their normal sequence. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 also follows a normal arrangement in which the letters of Pei and Ayin are now reversed. Letter 17 becomes letter number 16. Letter 16 is now number 17. In chapters 1 to 2, there are 3 lines per verse, with only 2 exceptions in which there are 4 lines per verse. And these are chapter 1, verse 7, and chapter 2, verse 19. So in chapters 1 to 2, every verse is going to have 3 lines, with the exception of verse 7 in chapter 1 and verse 19 in chapter 2. They have more, 4 lines. Okay. Chapter 3 only contains 1 line per verse. Chapter 4 uses 2 lines per verse. And the third thing, chapters 1, 2, and 4 contain a total of 22 verses, 22 letters of the alphabet. This is 1 verse per letter. Again, Hebrew alphabet, 22 letters. There's 1 verse per each letter in chapters 1, 2, and 4. But in chapter 3, there are 3 verses per Hebrew letter. So there's a total of 66 verses in chapter 3. First 3 verses begin with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Aleph. The second 3 verses begin with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Bet. Whew. Now, why were chapters 1 to 4 written in the acrostic form? Good question. Glad you asked. The point is that the tragedy is total, if we were to say it from A to Z. The tragedy of the destruction of Jerusalem is total. It's from A to Z. It was completely destroyed. Or a Hebrew would say the tragedy was total. It was from Aleph to Tav. Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The tragedy is total from Aleph to Tav, from A to Z. Chapter 5, the final chapter, was not written in the acrostic style. However, it does contain 22 verses, same as chapter 1, 2, and 4. So it contains 22 letters, but it's not written in the acrostic form, and each verse contains 2 lines. That's basically the style. So 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations. Each chapter is a self-contained unit. 5 divisions of the book. First division contains chapter 1, which deals with the destruction and desolation of Jerusalem. Okay, we're gone past the introduction stage now. Here we go. We're going to see first up the lamentation of Jeremiah. Lamentation. This is the first major division of the book, destruction and desolation of Jerusalem. And we see this chapter 1 in 2 sections. First of all, we're going to see verses 1 to 11, which is the lamentation of Jeremiah. Then we're going to see 12 to 22, lamentation of Jerusalem. Now, we see 2 sections now with regarding the lamentation of Jeremiah. First one is the desolation of the city in chapter 1, verses 1 to 7. We won't read all 7 verses. We just read them as we go along. Verse 1. How does a city sit solitary that was full of people? She's become as a widow that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces is become a tributary. Now, desolation of the city, we see in verses 1 to 7. First Hebrew letter in verse 1 is also the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. And it brings with it the first acrostic of Lamentations. How does the city sit solitary that was full of people? The Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is the term how, E-I-C-H-A-H. This word ikat is found elsewhere in Deuteronomy 1:12, Isaiah 1:21, and Jeremiah 48:17. Now, these are the only place. And in Lamentations 2, verse 1 and 4, 1 to 2, along with here in 1:1. Now, these are the only places where this particular form of the word is found. This word it's an expression of complaint mingled with astonishment, right? How did this happen to Jerusalem? They're saying, how is this possible that this has happened to Jerusalem? It's unbelievable. How did it happen? This city that was once great among the nations and a princess among provinces, she's become as a widow. She that was a princess among the provinces is become a tributary. How in the world is this possible? That's what it's saying. So what we see here is we have 3 past glories are followed by 3 present day degenerations. All right. First of all, on one hand, she was full of people. She was full of people, a great city, but now she sits solitary. Second, on one hand, she was great among the nations, but now she's a widow. Third, on one hand, she was a princess among the provinces, but now she has become a tributary. Now, a tributary is a forced laborer or a slave. So what we see here is there's a 3-fold past glories that are followed by 3-fold present day degenerations. Second verse, she weeps sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. So verse 2 now begins with the Hebrew letter bet, which means weeps. She weeps sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. The Hebrew word actually means double weeping, or weeping she weeps. She weeps a lot. Now, according to the rabbis, this is what the rabbis say, okay, not what the scriptures say. According to the rabbis, the double weeping refers to weeping over both the first and second temples. But that can't be a correct interpretation. Why? Because the second temple hasn't even been destroyed yet, hadn't even been built yet. So this book was written long before the second temple was destroyed. Among all her lovers, she had none to comfort. The nations she pursued were the very ones she sought comfort from, but none of them came through in her behalf. Something we actually saw back in the book of Jeremiah. So all her friends have dealt treacherously with her to become her enemies. The surrounding nations, which she tried to become allied with, as mentioned back in Jeremiah 22, verse 20, have proven to be of no help whatsoever. They're not interested in help in aligning themselves with her. Judah has gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtook her within the straits. So verse 3 begins with the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Gimel, and Gimel is the initial letter of the Hebrew term for gone into captivity. So Gimel, the actual word is Galah, as in the bird, Galah, G-A-L-A-H. Oh, I didn't put it up there. Galah. Judah went into captivity. Why? Two reasons. First of all, for afflictions. Second, because of great servitude. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her persecutors overtook her within the straits. Hebrew term for straits here, it's metzah, also means distress. So when the Babylonians attacked and conquered Judah, the people found themselves in a very difficult situation, a tight strait. And for this reason, there was this lack of rest. Verse 4, the ways of Zion do mourn, because none can come to the solemn assembly. All her gates are desolate. Her priests do sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she herself is in bitterness. So verse 4, it's the fourth verse, therefore it needs to begin with the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is the letter Dalet. Dalet is the first letter of the Hebrew term for the ways of, or the Hebrew word dachi. Dachi. Dachi means the ways of. And the fourth letter is Dalet, which is the first letter of this word dachi. Now, the ways of Zion do more because none come to the solemn assembly. Well, what's the solemn assembly? Well, the solemn assemblies had to do with those three great festivals which all Jewish males were obligated to attend in Jerusalem. The three great festivals were what? Passover, and then Tabernacles and Weeks or Pentecost. But now no one comes to Jerusalem for any of these solemn assemblies. Why? Because, well, she's destroyed. All her gates are desolate. Her priests do sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she herself is in bitterness. Jerusalem's roads were empty of festival pilgrims. Why? Because all her gates had been destroyed by the Babylonians. Therefore, the priests were groaning, There's no reason to rebuild the temple. And without the temple, we got no work. No work. Female caretakers, Jerusalem's virgins, they were met with the same fate, and the city was now utterly disconsolate and bitter. Everything's gone wrong. Her adversaries are become the head. Her enemy, this is verse 5. Her enemies prosper, for Jehovah had afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her young children are gone into captivity before the adversary. Again, verse 5 begins with the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Hay. H-E-Y. Hay, H, is the first letter of the Hebrew term for are become, Hayu, H-A-Y-U. Her adversaries are become the head. Her enemies prosper. So, see the word are become there? So, instead of the opposite, which the Mosaic law promised if Judah obeyed, the reverse has occurred. Remember, blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. Judah or Israel was promised that if she obeyed the law, she'd be the head of the nations and not the tail. After the Babylonian conquest, the reverse was actually true. Judah had become a slave while her enemies, the nations around, prospered. Because of her sins, Jehovah had afflicted her among the nations. Jehovah has afflicted her because of the multitude of her transgressions. And the reason is the violation of the commandments. Her young children are gone into captivity before the adversary, and so the result of Israel's sins is captivity. Verse 6, and from the daughter of Zion, all her majesties departed. Her princes are become like harts or deer that find no pasture. They're gone without strength before the pursuer. So in verse 6, Vav, V-A-V, is the first letter of the Hebrew term for, and it is departed. Hebrew is the first letter of the Hebrew term vayez, or Hebrew word vayetzi. My best pronunciation, vayetzi, which means, and it is departed. And from the daughter of Zion, all her majesties departed. Hebrew term for daughter, which is bat, B-A-T. It's in the singular. It simply refers to the general population of Jerusalem. It's not daughters and daughters. It's just the population of Jerusalem. Now, the fact that all of Zion's or Jerusalem's majesty had departed, and that Jerusalem's princes were like the harts or deer that found no pasture, this indicates that the royal house was separated from the people it once ruled. This shows that this deals with the fall of the royal house. Her princes are become like harts that find no pasture. This emphasizes the famine of thirst. This also occurred during the destruction. In fact, they fled. The rulers fled in a very weakened condition, and this is probably the reason why the Babylonians or the Chaldeans were so easily captured in the plains of Jericho when they dug themselves out the wall and tried to flee from the siege. Jeremiah 39:5 has that. Okay, now verse 7, Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and her miseries all her pleasant things that were from the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the adversary and none did help her. The adversary saw her, they did mock at her desolations. Okay, now verse 7 begins with the seventh letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Zayin. It's the first letter of Zakra, the word Zakra, which means remembers. Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and of her miseries all her pleasant things that were from the days of old. Hebrew word here for miseries is marud, which means her wanderings, her roamings. Now, this is the beginning of the concept of the wandering Jew. And the wandering Jew, the concept here began in the days of Jerusalem's affliction and wanderings. So as she is being tossed to and fro among the nations, she remembers her pleasant things from the days of old. How wonderful it was back in Jerusalem, in the city with the temple and all the festivals, all the pleasant things. The word pleasant things here is it's in the plural here. So it's, it refers specifically to the promised land according to Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 19. In the days of the Jewish wanderings, they'll remember the good old days when Jerusalem stood firm. Now, when the people fell into the hands of the adversaries and none helped her, what happened was the adversaries saw her. They did mock at her desolations. They held her in derision. The word for desolations here is the word mishpat. Mishpat means cessation and annihilation. It comes from the term Shabbat. It is talking about they mocked the nations around. They mocked her Sabbaths. It's a special reference here to the sabbatical year mentioned in Leviticus 26, verses 34 to 35. These sabbatical observances were now mocked by the enemies of Israel. So, finish verses 1 to 7. In verses 1 to 7, Jeremiah describes the desolation of the city. Now, where do we go from here? Well, we're going to see the sins of the city in verses 8 to 11. Jerusalem had grievously sinned, therefore she's become as an unclean thing. All that honored her despised her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yes, she sighed and turned backward. So the sins of the city we see are in verses 8 to 11. Now, verse 8 begins with the Hebrew letter chet. This is the eighth letter. And the word means, or the word that it's associated with, chet chahah, it means sinned. So Jerusalem had grievously sinned. Therefore, because of her grievous sins, she has now become an unclean thing. So verse 8 now begins to provide the cause for the desolations of verses 1 to 7. Verses 1 to 7 describe the desolations of Jerusalem. Verses 8 to 11 describes the reasons for that desolation. And the key reason is that Jerusalem has become an unclean thing. Now, Hebrew term or Hebrew word for unclean thing is the word nidah, N-I-D-D-A-H, which means impurity. It's actually meaning the uncleanness of the menstrual cycle talked about back in Leviticus 15, verse 19. It's also the uncleanness after childbirth mentioned in the same book in Leviticus 12, verse 5. So because of her great sins that she sinned against Jehovah, Jerusalem had become unclean, like a menstruating woman or a woman after childbirth. He goes on to say here, all that honored her in the past now despise her because they saw her nakedness. Now, Hebrew term for nakedness here, ervah, E-R-V-A-H, is viewed here as a mark of ill repute. Jerusalem's former admirers rejected her because she had been disgraced. Nobody wanted to be with a disgraced woman. Yes, she sighed and she turned backward. So even she herself, Jerusalem herself, was groaning and had turned away. This is again, remember Jeremiah's word in his book was the word shuv, which means to turn back or to return. He's using it again here in this book. See, it was Jeremiah who wrote this book. Jeremiah's favorite word, shuv, S-H-U-V. Yeah, verse 9 goes like this. Her filthiness was in her skirts. She remembered not her latter end. Therefore she is come down wonderfully. She had no comforter. Behold, O Jehovah, my affliction. The enemy had magnified himself. So verse 9 now begins with the 9th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, tet. Tet is the first letter of the Hebrew term for filthiness, tumata, not tomato, but tumata, T-U-M-A-T-A-H. And this term refers to ritual and moral uncleanness. Her filthiness was in her skirts. She remembered not her latter end. Again, filthiness is ritual and moral uncleanness. It's a quotation actually from Isaiah 47, verse 7. Therefore is she come down wonderfully. The word wonderfully here emphasizes a job that only God can perform. The destruction of Jerusalem was accomplished by God, even though he used the Babylonians as the means. The word wonderfully here, Pele, P-E-L-E, is only ever used of God. P-E-L-E. So, the destruction of Jerusalem was accomplished by God, even though he used the Babylonians as the means. And as a result, what happened to her? Well, she had no comforter. She had no comforter, no menachem. Behold, O Jehovah, my affliction, for the enemy had magnified himself. The subject here is for God to behold the affliction of Jerusalem. Have a look upon us, God. And the reason is that the enemy has magnified himself against her. The enemy has conquered her. Babylonians had smashed her. The adversary had spread out his hand upon all her pleasant things, for she had seen that the nations are entered into her sanctuary, concerning whom you did command that they should not enter into your assembly. Okay, now verse 10 begins with the Hebrew letter Yod, Y-O-D, first letter of the Hebrew term for his hand, Yado, Y-I-D-O. The adversary has spread out his hand against all her pleasant things. Well, the pleasant things here refers to the temple treasury. That's the pleasant things. For she had seen that the nations are entered into her sanctuary. Now, the pagan nations who were the Gentiles entered the sanctuary. Entering the Holy of Holies was punishable by death. Now, why didn't they die? Death was inflicted by the law and by God himself. But what happened? Remember, back in Ezekiel chapters 8 to 11, the Shekinah glory had departed from Israel. It had departed from the temple. Therefore, it was possible for these Gentiles to enter the sanctuary because it wasn't in there anymore, and not suffer any penalties for it. Concerning whom you did command they should not enter in your assembly. Remember, who could enter into the Holy of Holies? Only the high priest could enter this sanctuary. And even he was allowed only to do so once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Anyone else who entered the Holy of Holies was executed, killed. God, under the Mosaic law, commanded the Gentiles not to enter this temple under pain of death. But that was no longer valid. The Babylonians had now entered the assembly. They'd entered right into it. Why? The presence of God was no longer there. It had departed because of the terrible idolatrous worship of the nation. In verse 11, all her people sigh, they seek bread. They have given their pleasant things for food to refresh the soul. See, O Jehovah, and behold, for I am become abject. So in verse 11 is the Hebrew letter Kaf, K-A-P-H. Kaf is the first letter of the Hebrew term for all, which is kol, K-O-L. The word means all her people sigh, they seek bread. So because of her sin, Jerusalem experienced famine during and after the siege. Food was very scarce. So great was their hunger that they were groaning in pain. They have given their pleasant things for food to refresh the soul. The pleasant things here refers to their wealth. They gave all their pleasant things or wealth in order to find a little food to be refreshed. They've given their pleasant things for food to refresh the soul. See, O Jehovah, and behold, for I am become abject. And verses 1 to 11, the lamentation was that of Jeremiah the prophet personally. Now, let's we'll start off. We've got 4 minutes. Now we're going to see the lamentation of Jerusalem in verses 12 to 22. This city is personified as lamenting. We're going to see 3 parts of it. We're going to look at the first part, the affliction by God, verses 12 to 15. And then we'll see the confession of Jerusalem and Jerusalem's plea in the remaining verses. 12 to 15, here we go. Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Behold, and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow, which is brought upon me, wherewith Jehovah had afflicted me in the day of his fierce anger. From on high he sent fire into my bones, and it prevailed against them. He had spread a net for my feet. He had turned me back. He had made me desolate and faint all the day. The yoke of my transgressions is bound by his hand. They are knit together. They come upon my neck. He made my strength to fail. The Lord had delivered me into their hands, against whom I am not able to stand. The Lord had set at naught all my mighty men in the midst of me. He had called a solemn assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord had trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. So here we have the affliction. Jerusalem is seen as speaking in these verses in the first person. Passage begins in verse 12 with the 12th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Lamed. Lamed is the first letter of the Hebrew term for nothing, lo, L-O. That's it. Hello. Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? The question is, don't you guys care? Doesn't anyone care? All these people passing by, all these people looking on, all these other nations looking on and seeing what's happening. Don't you even care at all? Behold, and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow which is brought upon me. No greater sorrow hath been passed upon any other city than that found upon the holy city of Jerusalem. Sorrow was wherewith Jehovah has afflicted me in the day of his fierce anger. Now, the anger against the sins of Jerusalem mentioned in verses 8 to 9, that's what it was against. Jerusalem was once a holy city, but now it's holy no more. It was anything but holy. In verse 13, we see the Hebrew letter mem. Mem is the first letter of the Hebrew term for from on high, which is mimaron. From on high had he sent fire into my bones. They prevailed against them. He had spread a net for my feet. He had turned me back. So Jerusalem recognized that her punishment originated from heaven, and that her destruction by fire was the means of judgment that God ordained for Israel. There was no possibility for the city or its population to escape Jehovah's, because he had spread a net for their feet and he had hurled Jerusalem backward. Also, he had made me desolate and faint all the day. I'm in constant misery. So what we see here is that the judgment is pictured as coming from God on high, not from Babylon below, who made the city desolate and its citizens, but Jerusalem sees it as the judgment is coming from God on high. In verse 14 is the Hebrew letter Nun, N-U-N. Nun is the first letter of the Hebrew term for is bound, which is niskad. The yoke of my transgressions is bound by his hand. They're knit together. They come upon my neck. He had made my strength to fail. The Lord had delivered me into their hands, against whom I am not able to stand. The picture here is that Jerusalem is bound. It's a picture of captivity. Jerusalem confessed that she was suffering as a direct result of her sins, and the yoke of her offenses was bound fast, and it was imposed upon her neck, just sapping her strength from her. Her transgressions were knit together tightly by Jehovah's hand. Jerusalem simply had no defense. There was nowhere to go. She was actually guilty of all the accusations God had brought against her. It was Israel's own God who allowed the Babylonians to conquer the city, and for that reason, Jerusalem had no power to resist. So, in summary, the verse here paints a picture of Jerusalem under a yoke of her own making, bound by her God to go into captivity, and into captivity she's going to go. The Lord had set at naught all my mighty men in the midst of me. He'd called a solemn assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord had trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. Now, verse 15 begins with the Hebrew letter Samek. It's the first letter of the Hebrew term for has set at naught, which is Silah. The Lord had set at naught all my mighty men in the midst of me. What's that mean? It means that all her mighty men had been slaughtered and killed in battle, and the bodies of the soldiers were scattered throughout the city by the Babylonians. He'd called a solemn assembly against me to crush my young men. Now, the solemn assemblies had to do with religious gatherings, okay? The picture here was that God himself called a holy war against Jerusalem, and in this holy war, the young men or the soldiers were killed by God's hand. The Lord had trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. Just as grapes are trodden by human feet to separate the liquids from the solids, so was the Judean population trodden by the God of Israel to separate the exiles from those who were allowed to stay in Jerusalem. The winepress here is used as a figure of God's wrath. It also appears in Isaiah 63 verse 3 and Revelation, they're there on the screen, Revelation 14:19 and Revelation 19 verse 15. So in verses 12 to 15, the lamentation of Jerusalem is that she has been afflicted by God. We're going to end there. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong, and we'll see you in a fortnight.